All right, so we are now live on YouTube. Ben, we'll do a gallery presentation here for the audience there. Ben Tribbett joining us. You're a lifelong Democrat, been involved in Democratic politics, at least I know, for going on 20 years now, it seems, even though you're quite young. You're one of the young. All right, so we are now live on YouTube. Crying out Ben, loud. We'll do a gallery presentation here for the audience. So, all right, that's there. Mute that. There we go. I had to mute that over at YouTube. I was getting a little feedback there. Hope you weren't getting that as well. So you've been involved in Democratic politics, for all of the Warner Cain years, all the way up through today. Where do you see the evolution of the Democratic Party here in Virginia over that time?
I think as the party's been more successful and has suburbanized and urbanized, it's also become vastly more progressive. And so I think we're both seeing an evolution of the state and an evolution of both political parties simultaneously. And the Democratic Party now in Virginia is very much driven in a coalition of upper income suburban women along with African-American voters, which is a big change from what the coalition would have been 20 years ago.
And where do you see the Republican Party going or shifting from to? Where are they now?
Well, I think the Republican Party, which used to control every high-income precinct in the state pretty easily, has collapsed amongst voters that are well-educated. They have collapsed amongst voters that are in a. I think they basically have collapsed in every demographic that involves any level of education or income. And so the Republican Party now is a less educated, lower income base that doesn't have the same priorities it did 20 years ago.
And do you think this is a result of obviously what's been going on in the national level, the national narrative, Republicans, the Iraq War, the collapse of the economy in 2008, the TARP, the bailouts, all that? This has become more of a culture clash for Republicans among lower income, and income is going to be equated to education. So it's more of a cultural shift that we're seeing in American politics today.
Yeah, no, it's. I think the cultural issues are what's driving the electorate now, not economic interest, and I think it makes it very complicated for a party that is now progressive with the Democrats, and I think it's solidly controlled by the progressive wing of the party to come up with policies that will be embraced by everyone who is part of their coalition now. And it's a lot easier to come up with policies like, raising tax rates on wealthy individuals when your base is lower income individuals. But when your base now has 2/3 of voters that make over $200,000 a year were voting Democratic last year, was a study I saw that came out based on analysis of those precincts, Chris, around the country. They're not looking for the same type of policies, and I think, especially on the federal level, this is where you're seeing the Biden administration have to walk a really fine line because its coalition is an anti-Trump coalition, not necessarily a firm governing coalition.
And that's really the difficulty for the Virginia Democrats is they're, as we're a bellwether, I don't know whether we're a lag or a lead anymore. We're certainly a reflection of what's going on in the nation right now as a bellwether for the midterms. And this is really the test for Democrats nationwide. Have they overplayed their hands in being, not Trump, but also very progressive or more progressive than the electorate otherwise presented to them in 2017 and 2019?
Yeah, and I think so far, because of the vaccines and the success that the Biden administration's had with it, I think he hasn't reached that point of reckoning yet. I think people are generally pretty satisfied with his first 100 days in office because of the situation that he came into. But that's not going to hold up forever. And I think we know from history that even by the time you get to the first of the midterms, which is the Virginia governor's election in the first year of a presidency, that there will be a different flavor to the electorate by this fall for sure.
And where do you see that flavor transitioning to? I think the next 60 days, gangbusters on vaccinations, gangbusters on the economy growing. We saw 6.4%, I think, growth in the first quarter of this year. You know, there's going to be a lot of positive vibes in the economy that, frankly, drown out people. I think Mark Rozelle from George Mason Schar School put out a column in the Washington Post saying, "Did Democrats overplay their hands?" And I was my first response was, "Does anyone care and notice it?" Because everyone's been frankly more concerned about and more interested in their own safety and their own lives, right? So where do you see this thing going throughout the summer and into the fall when voters are making up their minds, especially those swing voters in suburban districts you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think it largely depends on what kind of face the Republican Party puts forward as an alternative. Um, you know, the Republicans have not put up high quality candidates now for a number of cycles, and I think that allows the Democrats to win by default. And so, you know, if we're facing a Biden administration that has approval ratings that start lagging against a potential governor, Amanda Chase, I think the Democrats will be just fine in November. I think the question is, can the Republicans put a face forward that doesn't alienate voters and allows for them to reap the success should the numbers move. And, you know, they haven't done that since 2009. And the last time they put a face forward on a statewide ticket that I think people would find to be nominally acceptable and not with high negatives was Bob McDonnell. And it was the last time Republicans were successful. So,
Yeah, I don't know if they're bad candidates or just misaligned with the electorate at the time, because Gillespie in 2014 got really close to Mark Warner. Other than that, the statewide candidates that you mentioned, Republicans, have not been reflective of where that middle vote is in Virginia. Because at the same time, let's be honest, Larry Hogan, I think Phil Scott in Vermont, Charlie Baker, Massachusetts, they were more reflective of their states than the Democrats were. I mean, and they're very popular Democratic governors. I mean, Republican governors.
yeah, and I think Republicans made a big mistake when they nominated Gillespie in 17 for governor on the basis of his showing for 14 for Senate, because I think that was just a collision of factors that had nothing to do with any success he had brought to the table. And in fact, his campaign was so dead in 2014. That was part of how he got so close, was no one expected him to be close. And so no resources were invested because he was so far behind. And 2014 was a year where Republicans were having a lot of success. As you mentioned, Larry Hogan being a great example across the river. That's a state that is 14 points more Democratic than Virginia. And he was able to win, I think, by 6, while Gillespie was losing by 1, which means he was overperforming Gillespie by roughly 20 points across the river. So Gillespie was not a strong candidate. He had sort of a number of factors that came together to allow him to have a close performance. And then we saw that in 2017 when he actually had to run on his own merits, that he was not a real candidate.
Yeah, and I think what's extraordinary about the Gillespie performance in 2014 was that came on at the same time the McDonnell scandals were going on. So it really was there wasn't a lot of brand damage there. The Republicans that Gillespie really felt, but as the years rolled on, it did seem like the Republicans couldn't get out of their own way and couldn't. It was a game that couldn't shoot straight and put a credible brand and narrative up against the Democrats, who, for all intents and purposes, have been, moderate Democrats, pro-business, not scary, inoffensive, and okay to vote for if you're from, if you've moved into the state, which a lot of suburbanites do, and they go, okay, who are we going to vote for? Who are you going to put up? And Republicans go out there and scare the hell out of them. And Democrats go, we're pro-business, we're growing the economy, we're relatively competent, we don't have a bad brand yet. I think that's fair to say. But let's look now at 2021. Where's the Democratic brand in Virginia relative to the suburban swing voters who aren't that, wired in all the time on politics?
I think the brand's great right now. The question is, what's the brand going to be in 6 months?
Right.
And I think that, right now, when you have the success that's going on with the vaccines, which I think is almost everyone's number one issue, the brand is great. The problem is when you are successful with an issue, and I always say this, whenever it's a win for one side, their people forget very fast and move on to the next issue. And when you lose an issue, your people tend to remember. It's the whole concept of why off-year elections tend to go against the party in power, because of who's motivated and who's fired up and who's paying attention. And so I'm just not sure that even as historic and successful as this vaccine rollout has been, I'm not sure that voters are going to be casting votes, giving people credit for that in November.
Yeah, politics is about the future, isn't it? If it wasn't, Churchill would have been prime minister after the World War II. He wasn't. He was voted out of office very, very quickly. People vote for the future. To your point, once the vaccine is pretty well behind us, or those people who have been vaccinated, it's not just are we getting more vaccinated? Have I gotten more vaccinated? And what's in my best interest going forward? Are my kids going to be going back to school? Do I remember that? Am I concerned about that? What's the economy looking like? What's crime? I mean, the number one issue in New York City voters right now, outside of the COVID, is crime. There's a lot of taxes going to be going up for a lot of voters if the Democrats get their way. So people who are negatively impacted by those things tend to vote. There's a SALT caucus in Congress about the deduction on high value properties that's being led predominantly by Democratic suburban congressmen, because they're worried about raising taxes on their constituents. So that's a whole different ballgame. They're outside the bubble of COVID there, and that's a danger, I think, for a lot of Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, look, the 10th congressional district was drawn in the last redistricting as a place where you could put all the Republican voters in Northern Virginia to make the other seats as safe as possible for the other two Democratic incumbents. Now, it's a Democratic stronghold. Same thing applies to John Bell's state Senate district, drawn in 2011 as a place to throw Republican voters to keep them out of the other districts. It's now a Democratic stronghold, and that's because of the high income voters. And those voters are not naturally aligned with the Democratic Party in a long-term coalition. They were aligned with the Democrats for a short-term coalition to end Trumpism. And it was exactly the kind of voters that Trump is chasing out of the party. And look, I'm not saying that they will bounce back entirely this year for Republicans, because I think there's going to be some residual effects from having embraced Trumpism. I think there's some changes in long-term party ID that happened from that. I think it was a historic period of what he did to the electorate. But that being said, at the same time, some will move back, and some will move back on tax issues. Will be the first and foremost thing you could expect people to start to move on, because the Democratic Party policies are just not naturally aligned with what our voters are at this moment.
Right.
And that's a long-term challenge for the party.
And is that, and when we talk about that with respect to taxes, because I have this nagging narrative in my head saying, okay, all we asked you to be was not Trump. Get rid of Trump. And that was an overriding perspective from a lot of voters, Loudoun County, Western Fairfax, Prince William County. Look, we just can't stand the guy. That was the hardest message to convey to Republicans. That is, in fact, the reason they voted this way. But they're going to snap back or not show up, and they say, look, I didn't say raise my taxes. I said get rid of Trump.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just obviously Northern Virginia. It's Enrico, it's Chesterfield, it's Hampton Roads, it's all the suburban areas around the country that were having that reaction to Donald Trump. And I think that, one of the things that we know about suburban areas is people move to the suburbs to get larger homes, more property for families. They tend to have much higher incomes, and it's a set of voters that move in and out of coalitions very quickly. And they were in the Democratic coalition in 2006 and 2008 to stop the Iraq War. And they were out of the Democratic coalition by 2009 and were gone for basically 6 years therein, with the exception of President Obama's reelection, where he was able to successfully bring just enough back home to get reelected. But if you look at the difference between 2008 and 2012, those were where he had his biggest offenses. The higher the income the precinct, the more that he dropped from 2008 to 2012. And so those voters just swing an awful lot. They also tend to be highly informed. And I just think that when you look at Democrats being in control of everything in Virginia, that's not necessarily I see no signs that that's what those voters were aiming for. I think what they were aiming for was to stop Trumpism in its tracks, and they were successful. And now, as they look forward, um, having a balance in state government or having a balance at the federal government is something that appeals to a lot of those voters. You can see historically, balance is something that they like, and I think the question is, can Republicans offer up an alternative that creates that balance without offending people? And it's hard. Look, I mean, I've been watching the Republican nomination contest, and some of the stuff that goes on, um, brought into a general election, is disqualifying.
Let's talk about that. Let's run down the list of the candidates. I'll try to remember this in alphabetical order so as to not put the thumb on the scale. And I'm not going to put some people up there who are talking about, people who are in this low single digits, a la Peter Duran, Octavia Johnson. Who's the other one? Sergio De La Pena is doing quite well. I mean, I think he's going to overperform, but in the ranked choice voting format, let's start off with Amanda Chase, who is, playing an overtly racist card in the Republican primary, and she's got hard numbers that aren't moving, and the Republicans are concerned that still to this day that she might win the nomination.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the process that was set up to slow her down, with the instant runoff voting, is probably the best that they could have done to slow her down. It's hard for me to tell who's been the most successful signing people up for the convention. They've all cited different success and numbers, and we won't actually see till we get there. I know, Chris, you've been to so many conventions, and I've been there covering them. Oftentimes you have no idea until you're standing at the convention door watching people come in and putting stickers on before you realize like what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
And this one being at multiple sites, I don't think any of us really know who's coming or why they're coming.
Right.
But Amanda would obviously be the person Democrats would dream to run against in the fall.
Where would you see that voter split going? It's at least 60-40. I mean, Warner and Gilmore was 66-33. Do you see her cracking 35?
Yeah, I mean, look, Corey Stewart cracked 40.
Okay.
So I think she can. But
do you think she underperforms Corey though?
Corey ran in a bad environment, actually. I'm not sure if she underperforms Corey.
So because the environment's improved for Republicans, I think we both agree it has improved for Republicans because of the national narrative. I was at one gubernatorial event last night. I won't say which one, but the biggest applause lines were getting rid of Nancy Pelosi. Mm-hmm. And she's just hated in the Republican base. And the candidate hit that mark real hard. So you think she is the best candidate for Democrats, Amanda Chase? Let's go to Kurt Cox. Mm-hmm. Where do you see him?
I think Kirk is clearly playing a game trying to be everyone's number two, and be as unoffensive as possible. I don't think when you try to be anyone's number two that you actually get to be their number two. I have a feeling that while they've been big rivals, the two candidates that we haven't mentioned, Glenn Youngkin and Pete Snyder, I think their voters are probably the same voters. I think they're probably going 1-2 or 2-1 for most of them, even though those two clearly don't like each other. And I'm not sure that Kirk is having the success he wants in terms of being people's second choice. So I see him falling off pretty quickly.
Well, I would imagine, given all the texting and all the surveys that are going on, they know that they're not the number one choice. And obviously his play he's clear. He's saying, look, I'm not your number one. Make me number two, and hopefully I'll get there in the second and third rounds of this ballot, right?
Yeah, and it's sort of ironic because I remember, I think that was Pete's message in 2013 at his convention. I think he had actually put out a Valentine's Day ad talking about knowing how to be someone's number two. So, and it was a foreshadowing of the fact that he did not have the votes at that convention.
But it does it's not a foreshadowing so much as it's an obvious one. When you say please, that means he's probably in third or fourth. Kurt Cox, would you not say at this point?
I agree. Yep.
Let's alphabetical order then. Let's go to Pete Snyder.
Yeah, so I think that Pete has he's running a very aggressive conservative campaign, and I think that he's going to have to answer for some of that in the general election if he makes it there, because he's branding himself very hard to the right. His endorsements are hard to the right. I've noticed that when I watch television, he's up on TV commercials for this convention with endorsed by Trump's team. That's going to box him in a little bit when it comes time to move to the general election. And so, I think that he profile wise is a great candidate for the Republicans. But the question is how much is he boxing himself in order to get the nomination?
Well, and I think he's more up against for the Trump. If you're going to go throw bunny ears around the Trump vote, if Amanda's numbers haven't moved, it means Pete's not getting into that Trump area then.
Yeah, and I can't speak to whether Amanda's numbers have moved or not, but again, I think it's one of those things we won't really know until, if we were standing there, Chris, on, is it it's in 8 days, right? On Saturday. I think that we'd be able to figure it out in about 5 minutes just watching the people come in. But until you see them, it's hard to know what are they actually doing and thinking.
What did you make of the Democratic Governors Association's attack on Pete Snyder? I think it came out yesterday, maybe the day before. They put up a website, Pete Snyder, he's the worst or whatever. And of course, Pete was like, "Oh, the Democrats are attacking me because they're afraid." My take is, no, that's the guy they want.
I think the Democrats are trying to define him, and I think that he is the least defined of the candidates, and so I think that they're trying to define him. I don't think that anyone expects Glenn Youngkin, who we haven't talked about yet, to be someone who's able to aggressively reach into the Democratic base of voters. He's sort of a boring nothing burger that's spending his own money. And so while he won't offend Republicans, he's not likely to reach into Democrats either. And so I wouldn't say it's not that Democrats are not concerned about him. I mean, he could put in a lot of money and be a credible candidate. It's just that he hasn't demonstrated any sort of ability to do anything interesting, at least to date. He seems like he's just sort of running and going to put up his ads are generic, his message generic. He's just sort of a nothing burger. And so Pete, on the other hand, I think what he's done is, aggressively reaching out into some Democratic leaning communities, particularly like younger entrepreneurs that are he was supporting through his 30-day fund that you can see were very, very diverse, and a lot of them in urban areas. And that is I'm sure that's something that the DGA is looking at, concerned because Virginia is now at least a leaning blue state. And when you have someone starting to reach out into Democratic leaning communities, it's going to get their attention and concern.
Especially on the economic front, when you did, I think Pete did yeoman's work on that Virginia 30-day fund. It was a great idea. It was mirrored throughout the country. I think Barstool Sports, what's the guy's, Dave Portnoy picked it up, put a bunch of money in there. And it really did help. And especially at that granular level, what people really care about, that small business. Let's shift over to Glenn Youngkin. Obviously a big checkbook, one the Republicans in Virginia aren't used to seeing. It's been estimated that he's worth $250 million. I think that's extremely low given his position at Carlyle. And I know a little bit about the private equity sector to know that if you're at 30 years at Carlyle Group and you're worth $250 million, you're not the CEO. I mean, there's just those numbers are very, very different. And reports, I've heard some wild reports on what he's willing to spend in the general election, upwards of $60, $75 million, which is still not a lifestyle change for the Youngkin household. Where do you see Glenn Youngkin? You call it a nothing burger, but a lot of troops on the ground, they say they got in 16,000 pre-filed delegates. What do you see? I mean, did the Democrats want to run against him?
Well, I think that, Terry McAuliffe is wealthy, but he doesn't really put his own money into campaigns. Right. And you've seen that in the past, that Terry's not a check writer. He could, but he doesn't like to do that. And so, of course, it's concerning to see somebody that could drop $30-40 million on the race. I have been interested in watching the Republican contest that Youngkin and Snyder are essentially spending the same amount of their own money, given that Youngkin is obviously a lot wealthier than Snyder is, that Youngkin's not trying to just up him. And that's an interesting thing, cautionary tale for the general election, right? Because you think about like a Michael Bloomberg type of candidacy in New York City, And part of what Bloomberg's candidacy did was whatever Democrats were spending, he was going to do 5 times more. He didn't care whether it was cost effective or not. If you were a Democratic consultant in New York City and you normally got paid $10,000 a month to do something, Michael Bloomberg would pay you 25. And that was how he recruited and got a team together to be elected mayor. I haven't seen Youngkin doing that yet. If he was, he would be just taking whatever number Pete was spending and vastly outspending him. There's certainly more that he could be spending on in this nomination. And so what that tells me, Chris, is that when you have a candidate like Youngkin who can self-fund, there's two types. There are the type that say, I'm going to blow the doors off of this thing and I'm going to outspend and make change that way. And then there's other ones that actually want to look at the books and are more careful with it and want to see like, well, I want to be cost effective, and cost effective isn't scary. Cost effective is it's dangerous, but it's not scary. The thing that would scare people is if Youngkin was coming and dropping $20 million in this convention and then saying he was going to throw $50 million more at the general. That would actually scare people. But dropping $5 million of his own money in a Republican nominating convention isn't going to scare anyone for the general. I don't think you go from 5 to 50.
Okay, well, that was just in the first 2 weeks, I think, from the report. First 3 months, rather, the first quarter.
Still, all the activity was.
What's that?
Which is when almost all the activity was.
Right, and I did find it interesting that they both were spending the same amount of money relative, which means I think they put their budgets together and said, what do we need to win? And that's it, right? We're not going to dip but so much into the well here. But obviously the resources of Youngkin have to bring about, a yellow flag of caution for the Democratic Party in Virginia, because one of the things that they have done in Virginia is dramatically outspend Republicans in the last several cycles. So it's one thing to say Republicans didn't have good candidates, another thing to say they were completely underfunded. A la, let's see, McAuliffe against Cuccinelli.
I got to come out on that. No, they were underfunded because they were terrible candidates.
Well, yeah, but that goes hand in hand. I mean, that goes hand in hand. I mean, you don't get outspent, you get outraised, and you get outraised because you're not a good candidate. It goes hand in hand.
Right, but it starts with not being a good candidate.
Oh, absolutely. But this one out of the gate for Youngkin is, I can come in with a big checkbook and I don't need to raise money. Mm-hmm. And that recalibrates the entire game, if you will, when it comes to politics. And because of what you said earlier about, Republicans losing upper income, higher educated voters in Virginia, Youngkin can make the play for them, whereas some others might not. Now, I'm not saying Snyder, Cox, Chase, whatever, but just saying the dynamic you presented earlier where Republicans have been losing, he might be able to marginally get back what Republicans have lost.
Look, I mean, Youngkin is spending, if on DC network TV, if he actually is going to come in and do that, we're talking about $1.5 million a week minimum for DC network television. And Terry McAuliffe's going to be up on DC network TV in August. So what you're really talking about is, if Youngkin coming in and outspending him in June and July, unless he's going to drop a real check on it. And if Youngkin's willing to go to a high 8, low 9 type of budget in terms of what he will spend, he could be a game changer. If he's going to put in $20 million in this race, that's not going to be enough to change the outcome. All it's going to do is mean that he's paying for things that other donors would have otherwise done, and he's just not asking for money.
So when you say high 8, you mean high 8 figures. What would it take for a candidate like Glenn Youngkin to spend, or what? Let me back that up. Let me put that on Glenn. What do Republicans have to spend to be competitive in Virginia this year for the governorship?
Well, Youngkin has to spend a lot more than Snyder would, right? Because Youngkin's running as sort of a nothing burger. So it takes more to get the impressions through. So I think, if I was advising Youngkin, I would be saying, you got to spend $80 million in this general election if you want to run as a nothing burger again. And he's sort of a finger in the wind, waiting for the environment to move and hopefully take advantage of it. And that price can go down as you get closer to the general. But the problem that you have with it is that the reason the cost goes up is the length of time that you're on the air and the amount of time that you're communicating. It's not necessarily just the intensity. Right. And so you really can't plan on what the environment's going to be like in October with how you make your spending decisions in June.
Right,
And
especially since voting now begins September 18th.
right. And remember that like when Mark Warner put in, 15 million or 20 million against John Warner, those were 1996 costs. So,
Right.
just for that, you're looking at a 35 to 40 just from inflation in today's dollars. And Mark Warner didn't overwhelm the electorate with his advertising in 1996 like he was making himself competitive.
Well, he
Probably not.
overperformed. He
He over,
overperformed.
well, he overperformed in areas that didn't like John Warner. He well underperformed in areas that in the suburban areas that we're now using to dominate the state. Mark Warner got annihilated.
Right.
I mean, he got annihilated in Fairfax County. So it was a very different coalition at that time.
Very different. Let's talk. Let me bring up the subject of buying points. When you talk about 1.5 million weekly in DC TV markets, and we talk about points. Talk about that for our audience. What does that mean? Let's educate a little bit here on what is a candidate really buying?
So a point means 1 out of 100 people, when you talk about your average consumers, saw your ad. So 100 points means that the average person each saw it one time. 1,000 points means the average person each saw it 10 times over the course of that period, and 2,000 would be 20. And so 2,000 points a week, where the average person's seeing your ad 3 times a day or about 20 times a week, would be a very intensive buy. Most TV buys are in the 700 to 1,000 point range. But when we're talking about someone free spending like a Glenn Youngkin, 2,000 points would be a number. Michael Bloomberg in the New York mayor's race was up in the more 4,000 to 5,000 point category, where every time you turn the television on, there was going to be a Bloomberg advertisement. I don't see Glenn Youngkin making those kinds of investments in this race. So with Youngkin's, what I think he will do, is probably, when Terry's doing 1,000 points, that Youngkin's doing 1,500 points. When Terry's doing 1,500 points, Youngkin's doing 2,000 or 2,500 points. I think that's what I see him doing, just based on what he's done in this nomination contest, is that he's going to want to outspend his opponents. But I just don't see him dropping the money yet. Every time there's a wealthy candidate, we always hear this of what they could do. Wealthy people didn't get wealthy by writing large checks. And a lot of times what they can do is not what they actually do. And so until we see Glenn Youngkin go drop $50 million in this campaign, I don't think we should assume that he's going to.
But I'm not trying to say that. It's more of an issue for what Republicans have to do to buy the points in the Northern Virginia market to become competitive down the stretch. And see, because you point out it's a chess game, right? But the chess is monetary. We're going to match you pawn for pawn. We're going to match you 2,000 points for 2,000 points, and you just don't really make that much. It's tough to.
2,000 points in Nova is about $6 million a month.
Right, and then what I've found in politics, though, is in just, if you want to say, Trump as a marker, he attracted money as well. So it's one thing to say I'll put in money as seed, but it's another thing to say I don't need anybody else. It's because they're going to get more money on top of that from national sources as well.
Certainly.
So you could see anyway. I don't want to get lost in Youngkin. But why do you say he's a nothing burger versus the other candidates? Just because he's unknown?
Have you seen his ads? I mean, the only thing memorable from his ads is that he had a basketball in his hand. Well, he's literally running as a nothing burger. He's running as a guy who can shoot a basketball.
Okay, so the takeaway is he's a basketball guy who did well in business, and he's running as a generic Republican in your estimation?
Pretty much.
Okay, that's your takeaway. Okay, that's very legitimate. Down ticket, where do you see the Republicans going? Have you got any sense of the LG Attorney General's races there?
Yeah, my gut says that Tim Hugo is going to be the nominee for lieutenant governor, and that Jason Ramirez is going to be the nominee for attorney general. But I think that the controversy that Hugo had this week with the texts that were going out calling Glenn Davis gay is exactly the kind of stuff that why Republicans lose elections and why they have trouble with these suburban voters. And it's just incredibly stupid. And I thought that Hugo's campaign response saying that it wasn't him was even dumber, because he had just sent a mailing out the week before that was all over social media that was extremely similar to that message with his authorization line on it. And so I think the text was a little bit harder hitting than the mailing was, but it was essentially the same message. So the idea that no, that wasn't him sounds like horseshit to anyone who would even look at it. And it was pretty stupid for Tim to do that, because I think he was actually in the lead, and he's damaged himself going forward for sure.
So, in your estimation, Ben Tribbett, you think Tim Hugo wins, but he's limping across the finish line for Republicans and is set up to lose at the statewide level?
I'm not going to say anyone's going to lose yet, because we don't know what this environment's like. And if we're looking at a Bob McDonnell type electorate where it's R plus 17, nobody's losing anything. But he certainly has not positioned himself well for where he could have been.
Well, and again, the Democrats still have to show up, right? And this just gives ammunition to the other side to say, see what they're doing. Mm-hmm. They haven't learned a thing. When Glenn, and then you go, well, to Glenn Davis, if he wins, he's positioned pretty well to say, I'm not the same old Republican.
That's right. But Glenn Davis, I think we know that Glenn Davis isn't going to win anything.
You don't think he wins this?
No, I don't think Glenn Davis was a serious candidate last time. I don't think he's a serious candidate this time.
All right. And Winsome Sears? Nothing. So Attorney General Jason Miyares. All right, let's quickly run through, and folks who are on the Zoom with us here, if you want to throw some questions into the chat now is the time as we run through the Democratic nominations, which are still a month and a week away, 38 days away. Terry McAuliffe pretty well got it wrapped up, you think?
Yeah, it's pretty much done. And I would just say on the last point, there seems to be a lot of Republicans that went missing for a number of years that have reemerged, and it's like a recap from my childhood of politics, of names that you'd read in the newspaper in the 1990s and early 2000s are now bouncing back and coming back in because they're realizing there's an opportunity here. And I'm seeing that in the activist and the delegate races. I'm just seeing a level of activity. People that I haven't seen in years, the old Tom Davis crowd in Fairfax County suddenly reactivated itself. So it's sort of like Republicans are definitely partying like it's 1999. But I think that in terms of the Democrats, we have a primary. The LG race is crazy. There's a ton of candidates. It's completely wide open. I think Sam Rasool had an edge up until last week. Now, I think Hala is right up there with him. I think the door is open for Sean Perryman. So I think there is the lieutenant governor's race is wide open. In terms of the AG race, I'm not sure yet how to gauge this. I think Mark Herring has a substantial lead. I think Jay Jones is a great candidate. And Jay Jones is coming in really, really well funded. And we don't know how that will play through yet. So that one, I'm just not sure how to analyze at this point, other than to say, I think that will be a really, really interesting race to watch in terms of what the future of the state Democratic Party looks like. What do you
if I don't want to put you on the spot here for making a pick, but what do you think is the best ticket for the Democratic Party in today's environment?
Well, I mean, first of all, whether Terry McAuliffe's the right pick or not, he's going to be the pick, right?
Right. We know that.
So then you're really questioning, how do you best balance around Terry? And take the AG race. You could make an argument for both candidates, right? I mean, Mark Herring has a long record of accomplishments, but he's been very, very progressive. And so if progressivism is sort of on the downturn this fall, Mark Herring's not a great running mate to be with. And Jay Jones could be better to energize voters. That having been said, if this is an experience election, which I think Terry wants to make it out to be, and Terry's essentially running as a third term of his governorship, then having an AG run for a third term is right on message with him, and they could do very well together. Then the question is, depending on how that goes, how do you fit in an LG candidate? And I think if it's Mark Herring, I think that people think it probably will be. That's why you're seeing all the party leaders coming out for Hala right now, because they know that you're going to have a person of color on the ticket. You need to have a woman on the ticket, and to keep voters energized. And so that's why she's getting the traction that she's getting, because she checks all those boxes.
Right.
if Jay's going to be the nominee for Attorney General, I'm not sure that it's going to be that important for in the past, Democrats always used to run on regional diversity, and Mary Sue Terry's been making a point recently that regional diversity doesn't really matter so much anymore to Democrats. It's all racial and gender, and I think she's right.
Okay. Great synopsis, Ben Tribbett. Thanks for joining us today. I don't see any questions in the chat. We're going to bid everyone a fond farewell and a great weekend, Ben. Great catching up with you. Go Penguins. Thanks for the win last night, getting us into first place in the division. We really appreciate that.
Oh, you're not in first place.
We are.
The Caps still have a game in hand, and they're even. So
they got to win first. They got to win first.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. See you, buddy. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Take care.